Have you ever taken a job that everyone told you would destroy your life? Well, that's exactly what happened to Sarah Mitchell when she answered a newspaper ad that would change everything. The year was 1887, and the job posting was simple enough. Housekeeper wanted, good pay, room and board included. But there was something about the way people's faces changed when she mentioned the name on that ad, Marcus Thorne, the richest rancher in 3 counties, and according to every person in town, the cruelest man west of the Mississippi. But Sarah was desperate. Winter was coming. Her savings were gone, and she had nowhere else to turn. So she packed her only dress, her mother's Bible, and what little pride she had left, and rode out to Thorne Ranch. What she found there wasn't what anyone expected, least of all Sarah herself. Now, before we dive into Sarah's story, let me tell you why this tale matters more than you might think. This isn't just another Western romance. This is a story about how sometimes the very thing that terrifies us most can become the thing that saves us. It's about finding peace in the most unexpected places, with the most unexpected people. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why Sarah's decision to take that job everyone warned her about became the best choice she ever made. But first, let me paint you a picture of what life was like for a woman alone in 1887. The dust never settled in Millfield, Colorado. It hung in the air like broken promises, coating everything with the weight of hard living. The town sat at the edge of nowhere, surrounded by mountains that looked like God's own fence posts driven into the earth. Most folks passed through on their way to somewhere better. The ones who stayed had reasons they didn't talk about. Sarah Mitchell stood outside the post office, reading the same newspaper ad for the 3rd time. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold October wind, but from something deeper. Something that felt like the last thread of hope fraying at the edges. Housekeeper wanted, Thorne Ranch, good wages, room and board, apply in person. The words were simple enough, printed in black ink that hadn't even had time to fade. But Sarah had been in Millfield long enough to know that nothing involving Marcus Thorne was ever simple. She folded the paper and tucked it into her worn coat pocket. The same coat she'd been wearing since her father died 6 months ago. The same coat that had seen her through the funeral, the sale of their small farm, and the long journey west that was supposed to lead to a new beginning. Instead, it had led her here to a dead-end town where decent work for a woman was scarcer than rain in August. The bell above the post office door chimed as Mrs. Henderson stepped outside, her gray hair pinned so tight it looked like it hurt. She glanced at Sarah with the kind of look reserved for stray dogs and broken wagon wheels. "You're not seriously considering that job, are you, dear?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the false sweetness of someone who thrived on other people's misery. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I might be." "Oh, honey." Mrs. Henderson clucked her tongue like a hen warning off a fox. "Nobody lasts more than a month at Thorne Ranch. That man has a temper like a wildfire and a heart colder than January. 3 housekeepers in the past year, and every one of them came back to town looking like they'd seen the devil himself." "What exactly did they say about him?" Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Mrs. Henderson leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say he built that ranch with blood money. Lost his family in a fire years back, and it turned him mean. Real mean. He don't speak to nobody unless it's to bark orders. Keeps to himself in that big house, drinking himself to death and taking his anger out on anyone fool enough to get close." Sarah felt her stomach twist, but she kept her voice steady. "They also say he pays well. Money ain't worth your life, child, or your sanity." Mrs. Henderson straightened up, smoothing her skirts. "Mark my words, you take that job, and you'll be back in town within the week, assuming you make it out at all." With that cheerful prophecy, Mrs. Henderson bustled away, leaving Sarah alone with the wind and her doubts. She pulled the newspaper from her pocket again, staring at those simple words. Good wages. Room and board. It might as well have said salvation and hope, because that's what Sarah needed. Salvation from the empty purse that mocked her every morning. Hope that she wouldn't end up like the other desperate women in Millfield, taking in laundry for pennies or worse. She'd watched her mother work herself to death keeping house for other families, and she'd sworn she'd never follow that path. But here she was, one step away from begging. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A rider was coming down the main street, and Sarah knew immediately who it was, even though she'd never seen him before. Marcus Thorne sat his horse like he owned the world, his black coat billowing behind him like storm clouds. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but Sarah could feel his presence from 50 yards away. It was the kind of presence that made smaller men step aside and women find sudden interest in their shoes. He reined in his horse outside the saloon, dismounted with fluid grace, and tied off the reins with movements that spoke of absolute confidence. Sarah found herself staring, trying to reconcile the man she saw with the monster Mrs. Henderson had described. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that came from years of commanding men and cattle across vast distances. But there was something else, something in the way he moved that suggested weariness deeper than physical exhaustion. As if sensing her stare, he turned. For a moment, their eyes met across the dusty street. Sarah felt her breath catch. His face was hard, carved from granite and disappointment, with eyes the color of winter sky. There was no kindness there, no warmth. But there was something else, something that looked almost like recognition, though they'd never met. The moment stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Then Marcus Thorne turned away and pushed through the saloon doors, leaving Sarah standing alone with her racing heart and the growing certainty that her life was about to change forever. That evening, Sarah sat in her tiny room above the general store, counting her remaining coins for the dozenth time. 53 cents. Enough for maybe a week's worth of bread and beans if she was careful. Not enough for passage to another town. Not enough for a new dress to make herself presentable for decent employment. Not enough for anything that resembled a future. She lit her single candle and pulled out her mother's Bible, letting it fall open to a random page. The words swam before her tired eyes until they settled on a verse in Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. Sarah almost laughed, but it came out more like a sob. Her own understanding told her that taking a job with Marcus Thorne was probably the worst idea she'd ever had. But her heart, that stubborn organ that had kept her going through her father's death and her mother's long illness, whispered something different. It whispered that sometimes the scariest path was the only one that led anywhere worth going. She closed the Bible and made her decision. Tomorrow, she would ride out to Thorne Ranch. She would look Marcus Thorne in the eye and ask for that job, despite every warning, despite every fear, despite the very real possibility that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Because 53 cents and a prayer were all she had left, and sometimes that had to be enough to build a future on. Sometimes you had to take the job everyone warned you about, especially when it was the only job that could save you. As Sarah blew out her candle and settled into her narrow bed, she couldn't shake the image of those winter sky eyes looking at her across the street. There had been something there, something beyond the hardness and the reputation. Maybe it was wishful thinking, or maybe it was the beginning of understanding that not everything in life was what it appeared to be. But she would find out soon enough. Tomorrow she would ride out to discover what lay behind the warnings, beyond the fear, and past the reputation of the cruelest man in 3 counties. Tomorrow, she would discover if sometimes the very thing everyone warns you about is exactly the thing you need. The morning came cold and sharp, with frost painting the windows like warnings written in ice. Sarah woke before dawn, her stomach knotted with the kind of fear that felt like swallowing stones. She dressed carefully in her only good dress, the blue cotton that had seen better days but still held its shape. Her hands shook as she braided her hair, pinning it back in the severe style that made her look older, more serious, more employable, she hoped. The ride to Thorne Ranch took 2 hours through country that grew wilder with every mile. Sarah had borrowed a horse from Mr. Peterson at the livery, promising to return it by evening whether she had a job or not. The gelding was old, but steady, picking his way along the rough trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine. The leaves had turned golden, and they whispered secrets in the wind that Sarah couldn't quite understand. As the miles passed, the landscape opened up into something that took her breath away. Rolling meadows stretched toward mountains that scraped the belly of the sky. Cattle dotted the grassland like scattered thoughts, fat and content despite the approaching winter. And there, rising from the valley floor like a declaration of intent, stood Thorn Ranch. It wasn't what Sarah had expected. The house was massive, built from honey-colored stone and dark timber, with wide porches that wrapped around 3 sides. It looked solid, permanent, like it had grown from the earth itself. Outbuildings scattered around the main house spoke of prosperity and careful planning. Barns, bunkhouses, corrals, all maintained with the kind of attention that came from pride in ownership. This wasn't the lair of a madman. This was the home of someone who understood the value of building something to last. Sarah reined in her horse at the main gate, her courage wavering. A wooden sign hung from wrought iron hinges. The letters burned deep into the wood. Thorn Ranch. Established 1878. Below that, in smaller letters, words that made her heart skip. Welcome to those who come in peace. Before she could lose her nerve completely, Sarah urged her horse forward. The hoofbeats seemed too loud on the packed earth drive, announcing her arrival to anyone within a mile. By the time she reached the main house, her palms were slick with sweat despite the morning chill. A man emerged from the barn as she dismounted. He was older, weathered like old leather, with kind eyes and a gentle way of moving that put Sarah slightly at ease. He touched his hat brim in greeting. "Morning, miss. You looking for someone?" "I'm here about the housekeeper position," Sarah said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Is Mr. Thorne available?" The man's expression shifted, something like sympathy crossing his features. "He's up at the house. Name's Tom Brady, foreman here. Been working for Mr. Thorne going on 8 years now." He paused, studying her with the kind of look that saw more than most. "You sure about this, miss? It's not that he's a bad man, but he's not an easy one either." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I'm sure." Tom nodded slowly. "All right then, I'll take you up. Fair warning, though, he's been in a darker mood than usual lately. Lost another housekeeper last week, and it's got him thinking maybe he ought to just live alone permanent-like." They walked up the stone steps to the wide front porch. Tom knocked on the heavy wooden door, then stepped back. "Mr. Thorne?" "Lady here about the housekeeper job." The door opened, and Sarah found herself face to face with Marcus Thorne. Up close, he was even more imposing than he'd appeared from across the street. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that spoke of years spent wrestling cattle and taming wild horses. His dark hair was streaked with early silver, and those winter sky eyes held depths that suggested he'd seen more than his share of storms. But it was his face that caught Sarah off guard. Yes, it was hard, carved by wind and weather and whatever sorrows he carried, but it wasn't cruel. It was the face of a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten how to find the gates. "You're here about the job," he said. His voice was deep, roughened by years of calling orders across vast distances. "Yes, sir, Sarah Mitchell." She held out her hand, then immediately regretted the gesture when he stared at it like it was something foreign. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he shook her hand briefly. His grip was firm but not punishing, and Sarah noticed his hands were scarred from years of honest work. "Come inside," he said, stepping back to let her pass. The interior of the house took Sarah's breath away. The front hall soared 2 stories high, with a staircase that curved like a work of art. But it was the silence that struck her most. Not the comfortable quiet of a well-ordered home, but the hollow silence of a place where laughter had died and never been replaced. Marcus led her into a sitting room that was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Fine furniture sat arranged with mathematical precision, every surface dust-free but cold. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, but the hearth was cold and swept clean. On the mantel sat a single photograph, turned face down. "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to a chair upholstered in deep blue velvet. Sarah perched on the edge, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Marcus remained standing, his presence filling the room like smoke. "The last 3 housekeepers lasted exactly 2 weeks, 1 month and 4 days respectively," he said without preamble. "They all left claiming I was impossible to work for. What makes you think you'll be different?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Maybe I won't be, but I need this job, Mr. Thorne, and I'm willing to work harder than anyone you've had before." "Need." He repeated the word like it tasted bitter. What kind of need drives a woman to seek employment with someone everyone in town calls a monster? The question was blunt, almost cruel, but Sarah heard something else beneath it. A man testing her resolve, maybe testing whether she'd run before he had to watch another person walk away. "The kind of need that comes from having 53 cents to your name and nowhere else to turn," Sarah said honestly. "My father died 6 months ago. I came west looking for a fresh start, but fresh starts cost money I don't have." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. "What happened to the other housekeepers?" Sarah had been dreading this question. "Mrs. Henderson said they couldn't tolerate your temper." Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd already failed some invisible test. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost thoughtful. "I don't have a temper, Miss Mitchell. I have standards. I expect meals served on time, laundry done properly, and my privacy respected absolutely. The women who worked here before seemed to think their job included reforming my character and brightening my disposition." His mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm not interested in being reformed or brightened." Sarah nodded. "I understand, sir." "Do you?" He moved to the window, staring out at his domain. "This house has been empty of feminine influence for 5 years. I've grown accustomed to solitude. I eat when I'm hungry, sleep when I'm tired, and speak only when necessary. I don't need conversation, companionship, or someone trying to make my life more cheerful. I need someone who can keep house without trying to keep me." There was pain in those words, old and deep and carefully hidden. Sarah felt her heart tug with unexpected sympathy for this man who'd built a fortress around himself. "I'm not looking to reform anyone, Mr. Thorne. I just need honest work." He turned back to her, those penetrating eyes searching her face. "The pay is $30 a month, plus room and board. You'll have Sundays off and 1 evening a week to yourself. Your quarters are in the East Wing, separate from the main house. I expect breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, and supper at 7. The house is cleaned from top to bottom once a week, laundry done twice a week, and my study is off limits under all circumstances." Sarah's heart leaped. $30 a month was more than she dared hope for. "That sounds fair, sir." "I'm not finished." His voice grew harder. "There are no second chances here, Miss Mitchell. If you can't handle the work or the isolation, if you decide you need to save my soul or make me smile, if you bring any drama or nonsense into my home, you'll be gone that same day. Do I make myself clear?" Sarah stood, meeting his intimidating gaze with all the courage she could muster. "Crystal clear, Mr. Thorne. When would you like me to start?" For the first time, something that might have been surprise crossed his features. "You can move in today if you're ready." "I'm ready." Marcus nodded curtly. "Tom will show you to your quarters and explain the household routine. Welcome to Thorne Ranch, Miss Mitchell. Try not to make me regret this decision." As Sarah followed Tom Brady toward the east wing of the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped into something far more complicated than a simple employment arrangement. Marcus Thorne wasn't the monster everyone claimed, but he was something perhaps more dangerous. He was a man carrying wounds so deep they'd change the very shape of his soul. But as Tom showed her to a comfortable room with windows that looked out over the endless grassland, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just for steady work and decent pay, but for the possibility that sometimes the job everyone warned you about was exactly where you were meant to be. Outside her window, the wind sang through the grass like a promise. And for the first time since her father's death, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found her way home. The first week at Thorn Ranch passed like a careful dance between two strangers learning each other's rhythm. Sarah rose before dawn each morning, her body still adjusting to the mountain air and the weight of responsibility that came with managing such a grand house. The kitchen became her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the familiar motions of cooking and cleaning while the rest of the world still slept. Marcus kept his word about solitude. He appeared for meals like clockwork, ate in silence, and disappeared again into whatever work occupied his days. Sarah learned his patterns quickly. Coffee black as midnight, no sugar. Eggs over easy. Bacon crisp but not burned. He read a newspaper during breakfast, his jaw working steadily as he chewed, his eyes scanning headlines from a world that felt impossibly distant from this mountain valley. She began to understand why the previous housekeepers had fled. It wasn't cruelty that drove them away. It was the suffocating weight of silence. The house felt like a beautiful tomb, every room perfectly preserved but utterly lifeless. Even her footsteps seemed too loud on the polished wooden floors. But Sarah had grown up in quiet houses. Her mother's illness had taught her the value of moving softly, speaking gently, existing without demanding attention. Where others found the silence oppressive, Sarah found it peaceful. After years of caring for dying parents and worrying about money, the predictable routine felt like luxury. On her fourth morning, she discovered something that changed everything. While dusting the sitting room, her cloth caught the corner of the overturned photograph on the mantel. It flipped face up, revealing a family portrait that made her heart clench with sudden understanding. A younger Marcus stood behind a beautiful woman with laughing eyes and dark hair. Between them, a little girl of perhaps 5 years old grinned at the camera with missing front teeth and absolute joy. The woman's hand rested on her rounded belly, suggesting another child on the way. They looked like happiness captured in silver and glass, like people who believed their love could conquer anything the world threw at them. Sarah stared at the photograph for a long moment, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The cold hearth, the untouched rooms, the way Marcus moved through his house like a ghost haunting his own life. This wasn't the home of a cruel man. This was the shrine of a broken one. Carefully, reverently, she turned the photograph face down again and continued her dusting. But something had shifted inside her chest, a softening toward the man who ate his meals in solitude and kept his grief locked away like a dangerous animal. That afternoon, while Marcus was out checking cattle, Sarah made a decision that would have horrified Mrs. Henderson. She ventured into the forbidden territory of his study. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a room that felt like stepping into Marcus's soul. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their leather spines worn soft from years of handling. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with ranch ledgers, correspondence, and what looked like legal documents. But it was the smell that struck her most, the scent of leather and ink and something else, something that reminded her of her father's workshop, of honest work and quiet contemplation. Sarah wasn't there to snoop or pry. She simply couldn't bear the thought of this room, clearly so important to him, gathering dust while she cleaned the rest of the house to perfection. She worked quickly and carefully, dusting shelves and sweeping floors, organizing papers without reading them. When she found a coffee cup with days-old dregs growing a skin of mold, she simply washed it clean and returned it to its place. She was just finishing when she heard footsteps on the front porch. Heart hammering, Sarah grabbed her cleaning supplies and slipped out through the back door that connected the study to a small garden. She made it to the kitchen just as Marcus's boots echoed in the front hall. That evening, as she served his supper, Marcus studied her with those penetrating eyes. Sarah kept her expression neutral, ladling stew into his bowl with steady hands, despite the guilt gnawing at her conscience. "The study smells like lemon oil," he said finally. Sarah's heart stopped. She met his gaze, ready to pack her bags and face whatever consequences awaited. "Yes, sir." "I specifically said it was off limits." "You did, sir." Marcus cut a piece of cornbread with surgical precision. "Why?" Sarah considered lying, making excuses, but something in his voice suggested he'd see through any deception. "Because a room full of books shouldn't smell like neglect," she said quietly. "Because even forbidden spaces deserve respect." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Sarah waited for the explosion, for the cold dismissal, for the end of the best job she'd ever had. Instead, Marcus took a bite of stew and nodded once. "Don't touch the desk." "No, sir. And don't rearrange anything." "I wouldn't dream of it, sir." That was the end of it. No lecture, no threats, just a quiet acceptance that surprised them both. As the days passed, Sarah noticed small changes. Marcus began lingering over his coffee in the mornings, not reading his paper but staring out the kitchen window at the mountains. Sometimes she caught him watching her work, not with suspicion but with something that might have been curiosity. The breakthrough came during her second week, on a morning when autumn decided to show its teeth. Sarah woke to find snow falling in thick, wet flakes that turned the world into a watercolor painting. The wind howled around the house like a living thing, rattling windows and driving the cold through every crack and crevice. She built up the fires in all the main rooms, then set about making breakfast. But when 6 o'clock came and went without Marcus appearing, she found herself genuinely worried. He was never late for meals. Never. Sarah ventured toward his bedroom, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. She knocked softly on his door. "Mr. Thorne?" "Breakfast is ready, sir." No response. She knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Thorne," a sound from within, somewhere between a groan and a curse. Sarah pressed her ear to the door, her concern growing. Another sound, definitely distressed. Taking her courage in both hands, Sarah turned the handle and stepped inside. Marcus lay in bed, his face flushed with fever, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He was trying to sit up but failing, his usual commanding presence reduced to human vulnerability. "You shouldn't be here," he managed, his voice rough with illness. "When did this start?" Sarah asked, crossing to the bed without hesitation. "Last night, just a cold." But even as he said it, another coughing fit seized him, racking his body with spasms that left him gasping. Sarah pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. He was burning up, his skin hot and dry to the touch. "This isn't a cold, Mr. Thorne. This is influenza." "I'll be fine." He tried to push her hand away, but his movements were weak, uncoordinated. "You'll be dead if someone doesn't take care of you," Sarah said bluntly. "Now stop being stubborn and let me help." For a moment, their eyes met in a battle of wills. Marcus, even weakened by fever, was not accustomed to being told what to do. But Sarah had nursed both her parents through their final illnesses, and she recognized the signs of someone too sick to be left alone. "I don't need help," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Everyone needs help sometimes," Sarah replied gently. "Even stubborn ranchers who think they're made of iron." Something in her tone seemed to break through his defenses. Marcus closed his eyes, his body going limp against the pillows in surrender. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing. Just rest and let me take care of everything else." What followed were 3 of the longest days of Sarah's life. Marcus's fever climbed higher, leaving him delirious and thrashing in his sleep. She moved into the chair beside his bed, cooling his burning skin with damp cloths, forcing broth and water down his throat whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. During his worst moments, when the fever made him ramble and mutter, Sarah learned more about Marcus Thorne than she'd ever expected to know. He called out names in his sleep. Emma, his wife. Lily, his daughter. Sometimes he pleaded with them not to go, his voice breaking with a pain that had nothing to do with physical illness. Sarah held his hand through the worst of it, her heart breaking for this man who carried such enormous grief. She understood now why he'd built walls around himself. why he preferred solitude to the risk of caring about someone who might leave. On the third night, the fever finally broke. Sarah woke from an exhausted doze to find Marcus watching her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "You stayed," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Where else would I go?" Sarah asked, smoothing the damp hair back from his forehead. "The others would have left, would have been afraid of catching it." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in days. "I've had influenza before. Besides, someone had to make sure you didn't die of stubbornness." Marcus almost smiled at that. Almost. "Thank you. You don't need to thank me. It's what anyone would have done." "No," he said quietly. "It's what you did. There's a difference." As Marcus slowly recovered over the following days, something fundamental had changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained began to crumble, replaced by something warmer, more human. Marcus began asking about her day, her thoughts on small ranch matters. Sarah found herself lingering over meals, drawn into conversations about books they'd both read, places they'd both been. She learned that Marcus had built the ranch from nothing, starting with a handful of cattle and a dream bigger than the Montana sky. He'd met Emma in Denver, a schoolteacher who'd fallen in love with his vision of creating something lasting in the wilderness. Lily had been born in the big house, the first baby to draw breath within its walls. The fire had taken them both on a cold February night 5 years ago. A chimney spark, a strong wind, and in less than an hour, Marcus had lost everything that mattered. He'd rebuilt the house exactly as it had been, but he'd never been able to rebuild his life. "I used to think the silence would kill me," he told Sarah one evening as they sat by the kitchen fire. "Now I think it's the only thing keeping me alive." "Silence isn't the same as peace," Sarah said quietly. "Sometimes it's just another kind of prison." Marcus looked at her with those winter sky eyes, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. But then he looked away, and the moment passed like snow melting in sunlight. Still, she'd planted a seed, and seeds, Sarah knew, had a way of growing in the most unlikely soil, especially when tended with patience and care. As winter settled over Thorn Ranch in earnest, she began to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could help this broken man find his way back to something resembling life. After all, she'd taken the job everyone warned her about and found something unexpected. Not the cruelty and danger she'd been promised, but the beginning of something that felt suspiciously like home. And if there was one thing Sarah Mitchell had learned in her 24 years, it was that home wasn't always where you expected to find it. Sometimes it was exactly where you were brave enough to stay. The first real test of their fragile new understanding came with December's bite. Snow piled against the windows like nature's own curtains, and the wind sang lonesome songs through the eaves. Sarah had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the ranch, the way morning light crept across the kitchen floor, the sound of Marcus's boots on the stairs as he came down for breakfast. But this particular morning brought something different. She was rolling out biscuit dough when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in their carefully ordered world. Crying. Not the wind, not some animal caught in the cold, but human weeping coming from somewhere deep in the house. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and followed the sound through the hall, past the sitting room, toward the back of the house where she'd never ventured. The crying grew stronger, more desperate, and her heart began to race with concern. Had Marcus taken ill again? Was someone hurt? She found him in a room she didn't even know existed. It was smaller than the others, painted in soft yellow with white trim. A child's room, Lily's room. Marcus sat on the floor beside a small bed, holding a rag doll with carefully sewn features and yarn hair. His shoulders shook with the force of his grief, tears streaming down his face without shame or attempt to hide them. Sarah's first instinct was to retreat, to pretend she hadn't seen this moment of raw vulnerability. But something in the broken sound of his weeping held her there. This wasn't the grief of 5 years ago. This was fresh pain, immediate and overwhelming. Mr. Thorne? She said softly, stepping into the room. He looked up at her with eyes red-rimmed and hollow. In his hands, the doll looked impossibly small, impossibly precious. Today would have been her 10th birthday, he said, his voice cracked and barely recognizable. Emma always made such a fuss about birthdays. Cake for breakfast, presents all day long, songs until our throats were raw. He clutched the doll tighter. I tried to forget. I've tried for 5 years to forget, but some dates burn themselves into your bones. Sarah knelt beside him on the hardwood floor, not touching but close enough that he could feel her presence. Tell me about her. I shouldn't be in here, Marcus said, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. I kept everything exactly the same. Her clothes in the dresser, her books on the shelf, her doll waiting for her to come home. Tom thinks I'm losing my mind. Grief doesn't follow anyone else's timeline, Sarah said gently. And love doesn't disappear just because someone does. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so human and vulnerable, it made Sarah's chest ache. She used to climb into our bed every morning before dawn, cold little feet pressed against my back, whispering about her dreams. Emma would pretend to be asleep, but I could see her smiling. We were so happy, Sarah, so completely, foolishly happy. The use of her first name wasn't lost on her. In this room full of memories and sorrow, formality had no place. What was she like? Sarah asked. A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's face. Stubborn as a mule and twice as clever. She could ride before she could properly walk, and she had opinions about everything. The color of the sky, the taste of her porridge, whether the horses were happy or sad on any given day. He looked down at the doll. She named this Rosie because she said it looked like it was always blushing. Sarah reached out and gently touched the doll's faded dress. She sounds wonderful. She was going to change the world, Marcus whispered. She was going to be a doctor or a lawyer, or maybe the first woman president. Emma encouraged every wild dream, every impossible plan. His voice broke again. They were going to have such beautiful lives. They sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the remnants of a little girl's interrupted childhood. Sarah found herself studying the room, noting the details that spoke of love and attention. A bookshelf filled with fairy tales and adventure stories. A toy chest painted with flowers and butterflies. A small rocking chair where someone had once read bedtime stories. The fire, Marcus said suddenly, as if he'd been reading her thoughts. It started in the barn, spread faster than anything natural should. By the time I got back from checking the north pasture, half the house was gone. I could hear Emma screaming from upstairs, but the stairs had already collapsed. The heat was so intense, it melted the snow 20 feet away. Sarah felt tears prick her own eyes. Marcus, you don't have to tell me this. I tried to get to them, he continued, his voice flat and distant. Broke every window on the ground floor trying to find a way up. Tom and 3 of the hands had to hold me back to keep me from running straight into the flames. I fought them like a wild animal. I would have died trying to reach them if they'd let me. They knew you loved them, Sarah said firmly. They knew you would have saved them if you could. Would they? Marcus turned to look at her, his eyes haunted. Sometimes I wonder if they're waiting for me somewhere, wondering why I couldn't reach them, why I wasn't strong enough or fast enough or smart enough to save them. Sarah reached over and took his hand, the same hand that had shaken hers so formally that first day. Now it felt different, warmer, more real. They're not wondering that, she said with quiet conviction. They're grateful you survived. Grateful you're here to remember them, to love them still, to keep their story alive. Marcus stared at their joined hands for a long moment. How do you know that? Because I know what it feels like to lose everyone you love, Sarah said simply. And I know that love doesn't end with death, it just changes form. Something shifted in the air between them, a deepening of understanding that went beyond employer and employee, beyond the careful boundaries they'd maintained. In this room full of ghosts and memories, They were simply two people who had learned that life could break your heart and still expect you to keep living. "I used to come in here every night," Marcus admitted, "sit in that chair and tell her about my day, like she was still listening. But after you came, I stopped. It felt like betraying them somehow, being happy again." "Being happy isn't betrayal," Sarah said softly. "It's what they would want for you." "Is it?" He looked around the room again, his expression lost. "How do you know when it's time to stop grieving? When it's time to put away the doll and close the door and try to build something new?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I don't think you ever stop grieving completely, but maybe you learn to carry it differently. Maybe you learn that love and sorrow can exist alongside new joy, new hope." Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd overstepped. But then he squeezed her hand gently. "Emma used to say that life was like a river," he said. "Always moving, always changing, but always the same water underneath. She said people could dam it up for a while, but eventually it would find a way to flow again." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Marcus stood slowly, still holding the doll. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said the best people were the ones who showed up when everyone else ran away." Sarah felt warmth bloom in her chest at the compliment. But more than that, she felt the weight of responsibility. Marcus was trusting her with his most sacred memories, his deepest pain. It was a gift she didn't take lightly. "What would you like to do today?" she asked, standing beside him. Marcus looked around the room one more time, then carefully placed the doll back on the small bed. "I think I'd like to have breakfast. Maybe you could tell me about your family while we eat." It was a small step, but Sarah recognized it for what it was. An invitation to share, to balance his vulnerability with her own. As they walked back toward the kitchen together, she felt the house itself seem to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for 5 years and was finally ready to breathe again. The biscuits had gone cold while they talked, but Sarah warmed them in the oven while Marcus made fresh coffee. They ate in comfortable silence at first, but then Sarah began to talk. She told him about her father's gentle hands and her mother's fierce love. She spoke of the farm they'd lost and the dreams they'd buried along with her parents. "I used to think I was cursed," she admitted, as snow continued to fall outside the kitchen windows. "Everyone I loved seemed to leave me, one way or another. I started to believe that maybe I wasn't meant for happiness, that maybe some people are just born to watch other people's joy from the outside." Marcus looked up from his coffee. "What changed your mind?" Sarah considered the question, surprised by how much her perspective had shifted in just a few months. "Coming here, I think. Taking a job everyone said would destroy me and finding out that sometimes the thing that scares you most is exactly what you need. Even if it means working for the cruelest man in 3 counties, Marcus asked, and there was something almost like humor in his voice. Sarah smiled, especially then, because it turns out the cruelest man in 3 counties is actually just the loneliest. And loneliness, I understand. They finished breakfast as the morning light grew stronger, painting the kitchen in shades of gold and white. Outside, the world was transformed by snow, but inside, something else was transforming too. The careful distance they'd maintained was giving way to something warmer, more honest, more real. When Marcus excused himself to check on the livestock, he paused at the kitchen door. "Sarah." "Yes? Thank you for staying, for not running when things got difficult." "Where would I run to?" she asked with a smile. "This is home now." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to examine too closely. But it was there now, spoken aloud and impossible to take back. Home. Not just a job, not just shelter from the storm, but something deeper and more permanent. As Sarah cleaned up the breakfast dishes, she found herself humming softly, a habit she'd lost somewhere between her father's death and her arrival at the ranch. The melody drifted through the house like a promise, the first music these walls had heard in 5 years. From somewhere outside, she heard Marcus's voice calling to the hands, giving orders and checking on the stock. But there was something different in his tone today, something lighter. Not the voice of a man going through the motions of living, but the voice of someone who was beginning to remember what it felt like to be alive. The job everyone had warned her about was teaching Sarah something she'd never expected to learn. Sometimes the greatest risk wasn't taking a chance on someone dangerous, but taking a chance on someone broken. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stay when everyone else had given up and run away. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very patient, broken things could heal. Not back to what they were before, but into something new and different and beautiful in its own way. As snow continued to fall on Thorn Ranch, covering the world in pristine white, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found exactly where she belonged. Not despite the warnings, but because of them. Not in spite of the danger, but because of the courage it had taken to stay and see what lay beneath the surface. The cruelest man in 3 counties was turning out to be something else entirely. And Sarah was beginning to understand that sometimes the very thing everyone warns you about is exactly the thing that will save you.